And I said, let grief be a fallen leaf at the dawning of the day. The immortal words of Patrick Kavanaugh's famous poem, made even more famous by the singer Luke Kelly, an appropriate way to start today's episode of Carja. Because at the moment the fields are empty, the trees are bare, and the air hangs a little bit heavier with mist, and you can almost feel the year exhale. We're in that kind of quiet pause between light and dark, between life and death. In Irish, uaigh, this time is called Mi na Samhna, the month of Samhain. It's the month of endings and beginnings. It's when we visit the graves of loved ones, we tidy the plots, we light candles in their memory. November, as it's known in English, Asperla, is also the month of holy souls, a time for remembering, for saying quiet prayers, for feeling the presence of those we've lost just a little closer. But it can be a lonely time too. As the days get shorter, the evenings draw in, and that feeling that we call uaigneas, a kind of deep, quiet loneliness starts to creep in with the winter air. But Accordia, uaigneas doesn't just mean loneliness. In fact, it doesn't really mean loneliness at all. It's older, deeper, and it carries a sense of something being away from you. Even the word itself, uaim, hides a connection to uaigh, the grave, and to uaibh, the hollow in the land. What if our ancestors didn't just feel loneliness, but understood it as part of the landscape, something that's woven into the cycle of life and death? This is Undercover Irish Accordia, and today we're tracing the emotional geography of a single word. We'll wander through the hollows of uaim, the silence of uaigh, and the ache of uaigneas. Because when the Irish language speaks of loss or longing, it doesn't just name the feeling, it maps it out. Over the next half an hour or so, we'll uncover how Irish words for distance and death share the same root, and why Mi na Samhna, the month of ghosts and memory, might hold the key to understanding what loneliness, uaigh in Irish, really means, and it's more positive than its English equivalent. Accordia, fáilte, and you're very welcome to Undercover Irish, the podcast about Ireland's hidden curriculum, the lessons that were always there, hidden in plain sight. You'll find them in the ballads we sing, the place names we pass, the poems we half remember, and the Irish words we still use without thinking. It's the history that sat at the edges of our textbooks, but lies at the centre of our story, the kind that explains who we are and how we got here. It's Misha Olin, and I love uncovering the meanings behind Ireland's language, lore, and I love to bring you history, linguistics, culture, and bring it together through a story. Each episode reveals how Ireland's real education has been happening all along, in songs, sayings, small moments of everyday life. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt there was more to Ireland than the version they were taught, for the curious learner who wants to make new connections, for the nostalgic soul who wishes they'd learned these lessons in school, and for the lovers of story and song who know that Ireland's history lives best when it's spoken aloud. After all, we are an oral culture. So wherever you are in the world, be a géisteacht, have a listen, sit back, settle into the sound. Whether you're at home or part of the great Irish story abroad, Undercover Irish invites you to rediscover and uncover the Ireland that's been with us all along, in words, our memories, and our music. Accordia, uaigh le chéile. Let's begin Accordia. When asked what the Irish for November is, often we'll say Samhain, or what's the English for Samhain, we'll say November. The first part of our journey today is to realise that while both months are used for the same month, or both names are used for the same month, in fact, they mean completely different things. The word November comes from Latin meaning 9. Nov, that part of it means 9, novem. It's from the old Roman calendar. So believe it or not, even though it's the 11th month of the year, it means the 9th month of the year, because the old Roman calendar began in March. So the first thing is that really doesn't make too much sense at all in its modern context. Uaigh, we call the month Samhain, pronounced Samhain. Samhain, as people will know, is the ancient Celtic festival marking the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. It's roughly halfway between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. So we're halfway there to the darkest day of the year, or the shortest daylight of the year. And culturally in Ireland, and as we've exported it elsewhere, the meaning of Samhain is when the boundary between the living world and the spirit world becomes thin. In fact, the lines become blurred. And that's where we get Halloween from. Samhna comes from the night before Samhain, when the ancient Celts and our ancestors believed that those two worlds intermingled and you could pass from one world to the other. And it's from this tradition that early Irish cosmology Samhain marked a threshold, not just between the seasons, the harvest and winter, but between the human world, on sail shot, this world or this life, to the other world, which is represented in Irish mythology as Tír na nÓg and other stories. The veil, or that kind of boundary between the two, was said to grow thin, and it allowed spirits, ancestors, and even supernatural beings, the fairies, to move more freely amongst the living. Because of this, Samhain was considered both dangerous and sacred, and a night when hospitality or offerings or caution were essential. So people had customs of dressing up to scare off the evil spirits. They had customs of leaving out offerings, and particularly people who had passed on to the other world in the previous year. Those people were remembered and prayed for, as it was believed that those people could again walk amongst us. Some of the ancient customs were fires lit on hilltops, particularly at Athboy in County Nimi, to protect communities and to ward off the malevolent spirits. Food and drink were left out for ancestors or wandering souls, and people disguised themselves. And this is the practice that evolved eventually into the modern Halloween costumes. People used to put apples, nuts, mirrors to foretell the future, especially regarding marriage, luck, or death. But while the modern version of Halloween, the international version of Halloween, is full of horror and darkness, Samhain wasn't morbid. It was a reverent time, a time of connection with ancestors, memory, and renewal. It acknowledged the cyclical nature of life and death, and believed that death was part of a passage and not an end, with the great rhythm of the year around you. Fires were extinguished and relit. The world pauses to reset. And with the coming of Christianity to Ireland, these customs presented a challenge to the church, which was trying to exert itself and exert its influence upon Ireland. And the Christian church used November and the beginning of November to implement All Souls' Day and All Saints' Day, and use November, Mina Samhna, as the month of the dead, or the month of remembrance, the month of all holy souls. So we have a kind of a crossover between the old Celtic way of thinking and the Christian way of thinking. Both philosophies, however, have in common with the idea of visiting graves, or caring for loved ones, or reaching out or praying for or thinking of the spirits who've passed on. And it's at this point that I introduced the concept of the grave. As Gaeilge, we call it the uaigh, uaigh, the uaigh. And in Irish mythology, or in Irish way of thinking, the uaigh doesn't represent an end, but rather it represents a point of communion. It's not something to be feared, but it's a somewhere to be visited. An uaigh, a grave, a resting place, literally means a hollow in the land. And it's linked to our landscape and memory as well. It's a continuity between the living and the dead, not a rupture. The land holds what you've lost. So if you look around Ireland today, you'll find places like Cnoch an Uaigh, the Hill of the Grave. You'll see that in a number of different counties. You'll see Powell an Uaigh in County Clare, the Hole of the Grave, Cúnta an Clár. You'll see Tobar na Uaigneas, the Well of the Grave. So all around the landscape, imprinted into the landscape, is the acknowledgement that this is a hollow, a place to the other world. Now, I began this podcast episode, this episode of this podcréile, by saying that there was a link between uaigneas, the emotion of what we would say as loneliness, the kind of translation that's used, and uaigh, meaning grave, or again, the equivalent of grave. But to link these two things together, there's a quote that I want to mention, or to move from uaigh to uaigneas. And this quote comes from Sean O'Riordan. Sean O'Riordan, an Irish language writer born in Ballyvourna, Gunta Churkey, born in Ballyvourney, County Cork. And one of the quotes that stood out to me is, it's a prose reflection. It's not a poem, but it comes from Erbil Spidoiga, something he wrote, or something that was published in 1978. And there's a quote in it that says, Ní hé an uaigh a scaras sin ach an tuaigneas. So, ní hí an uaigh a scaras sin ach an tuaigneas. Ní hí an uaigh, it's not the grave, and I'm using grave as the translation there, a scaras sin, that separates us, ach an tuaigneas, but the loneliness. So it's not the grave that separates us, but the loneliness. Now again, I'm using grave and I'm using loneliness as the translations there. But the point that I'm going to make is they have a different meaning to it, a different philosophical meaning to those words. But this quote links to both of those together, uaigh and uaigneas. Now, Chárde, let's look at the word uaigneas. Uaigneas comes from uaigh, which we think about as grave, and ness, the second part of it, is a state or a quality. It's literally a state of being hollowed. It's emotional, it's spatial. But let's contrast it with our English equivalent, loneliness. In English, loneliness is a state of isolation. You're on your own. You're alone. Loneliness. But let's think about the Irish version of it now, uaigneas, in a different sense. With uaigneas, it's a distance felt as connection. Uaigneas means something has gone from you, but you're not necessarily alone, even though the distance might be far between you. In some cases, miles, in other cases, continents, and in other cases, the other world. The state of uaigneas means that there's still a connection there. That feeling involves a connection with someone else or something else or another time. So whereas loneliness is a state of being alone, isolated, uaigneas, even though that feeling is melancholic and it's a similar feeling, shall we say, to loneliness, it implies that there is a connection still, that connection has some sort of a meaning, and the word expresses that. So with this new understanding of what uaigneas really means, we can revisit uaigh, which we use as grave, and understand that there's still that deep spiritual connection between the people that remember and the person that's gone. It's interesting, Chárde, to look at similar words with similar roots. So, for example, uaimh, uaimh, is what we use to describe caves or more accurately, hollows. So if we look around Ireland, we see uaigh, the hollow of the cat. This is in County Roscommon. And it's thought that this is a mythic entrance to the other world, the home of Morrigan in this case. So these places now provide us, or they represent, places of passing from one world to the other. It's a bit like going back to the meaning of Samhain in the first place. Uaigh. You have Paul Namrone, which is the Hole of Sorrows, in the Burren in Clare. This is a Neolithic dolmen. There's echoes of grief and continuity in this place. There's Dún na Huva. This is the fort of the cave in County an Clár. And believe it or not, Navan, County na Mi, on Uaimh, that's the cave. It's an everyday place name for the echo of the mythic language, if you like. Now, Corja, this is where we come back to something that will be familiar with listeners of this podcast, the idea of an Gaeilge, or the Irish language, as being not just a language, but a philosophy, intertwined words that carry a worldview, a way of feeling, a way of thinking, a way of imagining. So let's bring it to everyday. Okay, so let's take this to everyday language, speech that we can use and that means something as Gaeilge. So the way that we would express missing a person or missing something in English, it would be literally, I miss him, I miss her, I miss that person, I miss that activity, whatever it might be. But as Gaeilge in Irish, we have a lovely way of saying that. So we say, if you miss a person, you would say, Vrahim uaim hu. So vrahim is the verb, which means I feel. Vrahim, I feel. Vrahim uaim hu literally means I feel you away from me. Vrahim, I feel. Uaim, from me. Hu would be you. So I feel you away from me. So again, coming back to the idea of that connection. The connection is still there, regardless of the length of time, regardless of the distance, be it in miles, or as I've said before, continents. There's that connection still exists. Vrahim uaim hu. The emotion that's felt is reliant on the fact that the connection is still there. So there's an emotional truth in it. The other is gone, but still felt. You've got distance as a connection. So it implies presence through a kind of awareness. Even in expressing that, I suppose what we would call a melancholic emotion, it implies that the presence is still there. That feeling only exists because of the connection and the presence, despite the fact that there may be distance or time between both people or both objects, the person that's expressing that feeling. So vrahim, that emotion of to feel, comes from bra, to feel, to perceive, or to sense. And it's kind of an empathetic, like an empathy feeling. So in Irish thought, feeling is to know, and it's connection. Vrahim uaim hu. Not I miss you, but I feel you away from me. Another way of expressing it would be I feel your absence, I suppose, as béarla in English. That connection still remains. It's what makes it meaningful. Now, in that example, vrahim uaim hu, we've introduced the réamhacal o fada, which is a preposition which means from. So, vrahim uaim hu, I feel you away from me. That comes from the réamhacal, which is uaim, from me, uait, from you, uaigh, from him, uaigh, from her, uha, from them, uaing, from us, and uaimh, from you. Now, don't worry if you don't remember all that, but I'm sure anyone who's been through Irish education will remember that or have some sort of a memory of this. But this may be the first time it's explained in a way where we have it linked to the root word, uaigh, and linked to the emotion, uaigneas. So it's a state of being taken away. It's a state of something being taken from you. Hóg sé an leabhar uam would mean hóg sé, he took, an leabhar, the book, uam, it's gone from you. And so a cháirde, the Samhain mist settles in and we come full circle. In Irish, uaigneas is not just loneliness, it's the space between us where love and loss still speak. As a uaigh, the grave, to uaim and uait, from me, from you, even the language reminds us that distance can still be a kind of a connection. Maybe that's the real lesson of Samhain, of me na Samhna, that every ending carries a return. Every ending carries the seed. When we say Braham uamhu, I feel you away from me, we're not talking about emptiness, we're naming a presence, the kind that lingers. The Irish language gives us a way to hold what's gone and to still feel it. Cháirde, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Undercover Irish, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. Please do share it, send it to a friend, post it online, leave a review. It makes a massive difference to the show. And I'd like to thank people who have supported the podcast on Patreon or Patreon. And you can join our patrons on Patreon. I'll link in the show notes to link to that. If this is the kind of storytelling you like, this is the kind of history and culture that you like, please do support the show. Until the next time, cháirde gurb míle maithagh as ucht bhealum. Thank you so much for being with me. I really enjoyed this particular one. I love mixing up the linguistic references and finding new meaning or rediscovering meaning with those. And if you've enjoyed this cháirde, please look back on some of the previous episodes if you haven't already. The episode around CBT, around the CBT nature of the Irish language, of an Gaeilge, I'll link it in the show notes. And the episode around what we can learn from Luganimnacha, the place names of Ireland, in terms of their relationship with the body. You may enjoy that one as well. So, cháirde, I hope you had a great Samhain. I hope the month of Samhain, me na Samhna, treats you well. And I'll be speaking to you again before long, cháirde. Gurb míle maithagh, berigí bua.